Hello and welcome back. Today, we are going to be discussing the second half of the lecture, A Prelude to War. Specifically, we're going to be discussing some of the countries that are upset with conditions pre World War II. The first country I think we have to talk about is Italy. Now, Italy is one of those tricky countries. They are, kind of a second or third rate power in Europe, but they have a lot of pride. They're, the actually the cradle of Western civilization. The Roman Empire helped to, kind of set a standard for Western culture and a Western way of life. And so they have this really strong, proud history and, aren't excited about the idea of them being a second or third rate power. And, when the Allies from World War One treat Italy kind of like the little kid, like, put them at the kiddie table at Thanksgiving, that's really going to start to damage a lot of Italian pride. The Italians very specifically, decided during World War One that they were going to side with Great Britain and France during World War One, very specifically because they, they saw the writing on the wall and thought that the Allies would be winners, and they really wanted to expand their northern border in Italy. And so the Italians are unhappy because of, again, the Treaty of Versailles, and the Treaty of Versailles has really left Italy out. They entered the war on the side of the Allies very specifically to gain territory. They made very real sacrifices during the war. 600,000 Italians died fighting in that war. That's over 500,000 people that die. And, during the negotiations, during the Treaty of Versailles, Italy was kind of treated like a lesser contributor where, they clearly made sacrifices. Americans had, 114,000 people die fighting World War One, and America, was treated as, this, necessary component to victory. Now, it's true, absolutely true. Just counting dead bodies doesn't actually count your contribution to actually winning a war. American supplies, American money, and the vast number of troops we committed did have one of the largest impacts in that war. But nonetheless, Italy feels disrespected. They end up being treated as a smaller, lesser country. They don't really get their demands met. The expectation of, significantly increasing their northern border doesn't ever really come to fruition. And so, they're unhappy with that. They gain very little territory, and they feel like they've been betrayed, that they were promised that if they, came on the side of the Allies, that they would be able to get that territory. And then that never happened. There's some domestic issues going on in Italy as well. We start to see after World War One, and because of the depression that's taking over everywhere, that Italy is getting hit pretty hard by the depression. And so what happens is during, extremely bad economic times, you start to see that the, lower classes start to turn towards communism. The idea of communism on paper sounds really appealing to poor people. Let's take from the wealthy and redistribute that wealth out to the poor, and it'll increase the standard of living for for poor people, and everybody can be treated equally, which is the concept behind communism. Well, that sounds good on paper. Now, we know, because every example of communism that's ever been attempted around the world has absolutely led to just total failure, just a complete collapse of the economic system. And later during the Cold War, Cold War lectures, we'll talk more about that. Communism destroys the incentive to work hard. If everybody gets treated the same, why work hard? You won't get a raise, you won't get ahead. But it's more insidious than that. It's the idea of everybody being treated equally can only be enforced through violence. As if I'm trying to take care of my family, I want to provide as much for my family as possible. And if I have a little bit more than my neighbor, then, I can end up in prison for that. Or, a lot of cases that we saw in the Soviet Union and in China, they just take you out back and shoot you for that. And so, people don't necessarily really want equality of outcome. Most people recognize that what is better is equality of opportunity. And so the middle class recognizes that in that in Italy, the middle class and the upper classes say, "Hey, wait, this communism stuff, I'm not a fan of that. I don't want all the things I've worked hard and sacrificed for to be taken away from me and given to somebody else." And so, I made the sacrifice to go to school. I put off, I studied really hard. I didn't go party on the weekends. I saved my money. I didn't spend it. I invested it. And, I bought the things I did buy were responsible things, that maintained value, like my home, or I invested in my business. And now, if communism takes over in Italy, these middle class and upper class people are saying, whoa, like, better not take the things that I've worked so hard to get my hands on, and so they're going to be frightened of communism, and they're going to start to turn to organizations that are going to promise to protect them from communism, and that's when we're going to start to see a rise in fascism, which I find to be actually pretty interesting, because the difference between a fascist and a communist really isn't that much. The communists are totalitarian dictators that control the economy. They control all aspects of life: what you can read, what you can watch, where you work, and how much you get paid. The fascists are totalitarian dictators as well. They control what you read, what you watch. They can control where you work and what you own. Some of them will, some of them won't. It just depends on that particular fascist dictator. In Italy in particular, Mussolini is going to just put forth an extreme amount of control over the economic system. And so there's not really much difference between the two. And in actuality, but the fascists are really going to kind of trick the middle class into believing that there is a big difference, and that they're extremely opposite political philosophies. And primarily, they're going to do that by not talking about the class system, rich versus poor, which communists talk about a lot. They'll put it in more of racial overtones or nationalistic overtones. And most fascists are going to promise that people can keep what they own, so there'll be less redistribution of wealth. Most fascists are, in fact, socialists. Mussolini never really, to my knowledge, comes out and absolutely claims to be a socialist. Hitler will. The name of the Nazi Party isn't the Nazis. That's an abbreviation. It's the NSDAP, which the English translation for is the National Socialist German Workers' Party. So it's right there in the name. And so we know that if communism is here on the spectrum, socialism is right next to it, right there. And so not a whole lot of difference. But the fascists will trick the Italians into believing that their system is better by saying, we will protect you from the communists and we won't redistribute your wealth. We'll let you keep the things that you've earned. And so you'll see just an outpouring of support from the middle class and upper classes in Italy towards the fascist party. So the next country we're going to talk about is Japan. Japan is clearly upset at the Western powers, the established world powers, From our previous lecture, we talked about the failures of the Washington Naval Conference and the League of Nations and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. All of those really upset Japan because they believe that those particular institutions are standing in the way of Japan taking its rightful place amongst the world's top powers. Again in yesterday's lecture in the part one of A Prelude to War, we talked about how Japan is an island and it's industrializing rapidly, and to be able to keep up with that rapid industrialization, it needs resources, very particularly the mineral resources that can be found in China, in places like Manchuria, in Korea, in the Philippines, and they need to expand. Well, to expand, they're going to have to conquer those areas, which means war. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact is holding them back from being able to expand to get those resources. The entire League of Nations is designed to stop countries from, being aggressive around the world and taking over colonies and becoming imperialistic, which is exactly what Japan feels it needs to do. And the Washington Naval Conference feels like a shot at Japan, because to be able to do that, you need a strong Navy, right? They've got to be able to get their militaries to foreign places to be able to conquer them, and they need to use those ships to be able to protect the shipping to bring those resources back. And so a large Navy is necessary for, Japan's imperialistic ideas. And so the Washington Naval Conference limited the size of those navies. And so the Japan really starts to think that these old Western powers, and not all Western powers, because we're going to see that they ally themselves with Germany, which is a Western power, but the old world powers, Great Britain, France, and now even by association, the United States, are all out to get them. And so you see Japan, because they feel this way, they're going to start to look for potential allies that are also upset at these things, which are going to be countries like Italy, right, that we just talked about, feels upset. They're upset at the West because, they're upset at the old world powers, Great Britain and France, because of the Treaty of Versailles. They also want to expand. They wanted to expand to the north. They're also going to want to take another shot at Ethiopia and a few other places. And so Tokyo is going to very specifically be looking for those kind of other upset powers. Right. Like I said, they're looking to expand. They want to, to be able to get into mineral-rich Asia, and so, and they will. Japan is going to be encouraged by kind of the weakness of Great Britain and France and their inability to stop the rise of these fascist dictators in Europe, like Italy and in Germany. We're going to see, expansionist efforts, particularly out of Italy into Ethiopia. And Japan is looking around saying, like, well, I thought we had all these agreements. Like, we weren't supposed to expand. And these top tier world powers said that they weren't going to allow that, and now they're allowing it. And so Japan is going to kind of look at that and be like, okay, well, I guess all bets are off, that the Western powers aren't going to enforce the Washington Naval Conference and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And so the nationalists in Japan just start to make a point to the Emperor Hirohito that, look, we've got to expand, or our economy is completely going to collapse, and we're going to have to expand into China and forget these restrictions that these old world powers have put into place. And so what we're going to see is in 1931, Japan is going to actually invade Manchuria. And so this is, actually technically the very beginnings of World War II. Now, from a Western perspective, and so in American history classes and college campuses, European history classes, in actual, not European history classes, but classes on history in Europe, they really talk about the start of World War II being the invasion of Poland. But for most of the world, because most of the world lives in Asia, the start of World War II really is going to begin when Japan invades Manchuria, which is one of the northern areas in China. Japan is going to invade, and the invasion of Manchuria is going to be really kind of a harbinger of what we can expect coming forward. The when we're talking about the 20th century, the 20th century is the most brutal, violent, deadly century in the history of humankind. And the World War One, the Spanish flu, then followed by World War II. All the Holocaust in Germany, the purges in Stalin's purges in the Soviet Union. Needless, regardless of what happens in China. When Mao takes over after World War II, and Mao's purges have killed about 100 million people, right? This is it's a terribly murderous century. And World War II is a big part of that. And when Japan invades China, the Japanese are going to be absolutely brutal because the nationalists have taken over. The Japanese really have been taught that the Koreans and the Chinese aren't humans; they're dogs. And so we're going to see, just absolutely brutal treatment of of the Chinese by the Japanese, which is going to be a clear indicator of what we can expect when this war, really starts to get rolling. So, next country that we're going to talk about is the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Remember, it used to be Russia, but because of the Bolshevik Revolution, the communists have taken over. And so is now the USSR, or the Soviets. There's, however you want to say it. Occasionally, I'll say Russia. I apologize for that. It is not accurate. We should be calling it the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, or the Soviet Union. So the Soviets have taken over. They're very upset about the Treaty of Versailles. And so, the Russians during World War I, and we should call them Russians because during World War I it was Russia, the Soviets do an extreme amount of fighting. Let's be honest here. The Russian military has never been a great military, but it's always been gigantic. And so because the Russians were able to put up such a serious resistance to German aggression. The Germans had to, during World War I, fight a two-front war, which kept Germany from conquering France and, really kept the Allies in the game. Now, they weren't able to hold on forever because they were having domestic problems. And so when the communists finally took over, they thought that the war was a capitalist war to help rich people get richer, and so they withdrew from the war, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, this treaty was disastrous for Russia. It took away, areas in the Ukraine, which are like the most profitable, mineral-rich, resource-rich part of the part of Russia, and so which is absolutely devastating. The Germans took some of the best farmland, some of the most oil-rich land. They took significant portions of the Russian population from Russia, and so this was an absolutely devastating treaty for Russia, which after the treaty signed, they become the Soviet Union. And so when the Allies win the war, the Soviets now are thinking, hey, our side won. Even though we had to tap out early, our side won. And they're really kind of expecting to get all that land back. The problem is that, Great Britain, France, and America don't really want to give them that land back. I think everybody kind of that really looks at it recognizes that the Russians were instrumental in, the Allies winning World War I. But the problem is they're communists now. And so, these Western capitalist democracies don't want to empower this brand new Soviet nation. And so they kind of, shun the Soviet Union during the Treaty of Versailles, and they don't get that land back. And so you can kind of see why the Soviet Union would look at the Western powers and think, well, that was shady. And so they're going to be very upset. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to be pushed into the arms of, Hitler and Mussolini and Japan. These, you know, Germany and Italy are fascists and they hate communists. But it is going to, push the Soviet Union away from, people who probably should have a good working relationship with them, which is Great Britain and France. They have a common enemy in Germany. And so this is going to, the Treaty of Versailles is going to strain the relationship between the Soviet Union and Great Britain and France and the United States by proxy. So, like I said, they lost the most territory and lives during World War I. They feel like they should be rewarded for that, and they're not, which really puts them at odds with all these other major world powers. So the Soviet Union and even Russia to this day, because the Soviet Union will collapse in the 90s and become Russia again, they're still upset about all this. They feel like, because they're in a weird position. They're not really European. They're not really Asian. They've always had kind of, with the czars and with communism, these weird kind of forms of government. And then, their current, excuse me, Putin, that's certainly not a democracy. It's not a monarchy. It's some sort of weird dictatorship. They've always kind of been the odd man out. And it really leads to a severe sense of distrust. And so when we talk about Joseph Stalin later, you're really going to see that. I mean, he's going to go on a murderous rampage that'll kill somewhere between 30 and 60 million people within his own country because of this just sense of distrust of everybody, which includes, foreign countries like Great Britain, France, and America. All right. So the last country that we're going to kind of overview here is Germany. We're going to be talking about them in much greater detail in later lectures. Germany is, clearly one of the most dissatisfied nations. They had to accept war guilt. They had to pay war reparations. They've had to limit their military to 100,000 people. The Ruhr Valley has been demilitarized, so there's a part of their own country they're not allowed to put their military in. I mean, think about that. Think if like Canada told America that they're not allowed to keep soldiers in, Maine and North Dakota. Like there's no way we would be okay with that. We're a sovereign nation. And so Germany has been told that they can't keep soldiers in the Ruhr Valley area. So that's been demilitarized. It's Germany's just been absolutely devastated. And so all of those issues are leading to real serious problems at home in Germany. Their economy is collapsing. They don't have a military that can defend themselves. They've went from being one of the top tier nations in the world to this second rate, third rate power. They've had, not only have they been demilitarized, their country's been split in half. It's not actually half, but the eastern part of Germany's been taken away. It's been given to Poland. East Prussia is now like kind of surrounded by Poland. The port of Danzig's been taken away as well. It's been made an international port. That's an incredibly valuable economic port for Germany. And so there's just very just harsh measures put in place against Germany. It's destroyed their economy and made them really desperate. And so as they get more and more desperate, they really start to vilify Great Britain and France. They feel like all these problems are their fault, and they're willing to turn to strong leadership to try and lead them out of this this terrible situation. And so that will again lead to the rise of dictators like Adolf Hitler, who just essentially says to the German people, all these bad things here, right there, can't ever there, all those bad things that have happened to you there. That's not your fault. It's a conspiracy between the Western powers and the Jews, and that's why these bad things have happened to you. And the German people are willing to buy that very specifically because all during World War One there was no fighting on German territory. The Germans really believed they were winning the war until they decided to quit. And so then when they quit, all these bad things happen to them, and they're looking around and they really do feel like a victim. I don't know how much of a victim they actually are, but I think most historians look at the Treaty of Versailles and all of these. Nope, I'll get it. All of these bad things that are happening to them right there. This mirror imaging stuff, I'm struggling with it. All these bad things that are happening to them are the result of this conspiracy against them, and that they really are victims. They've, like I said, essentially overnight become a second and third rate power. Poland, which, new nation, not a lot of power. All of a sudden now they're a neighbor and a threat to German stability. And so, it's these things that are going to push the German people that are, as a matter of fact, at this point in history, one of the most tolerant societies on the planet. The Weimar Republic, gives women the right to vote before America gets the right to vote. They have fewer restrictions on like Jewish employment. Jews are actually allowed to work pretty much wherever they want within Germany. They're able to hold office and vote and do those things where most European nations won't let them do that. And so it's these things that are happening that are going to take Germany, this, the most literate, educated society in Europe, and one of the most tolerant societies in Europe and most democratic societies, after the Kaiser, the Weimars, one of the most democratic societies. And it's going to, turn them towards Adolf Hitler and fascism and totalitarianism. That's how bad things get for Germany. So, what's happening to the United States at this point? Well, the United States is going to essentially try to return back to the Monroe Doctrine. For most of U.S. history, we've been isolationists, semi-isolationists. I mean, not truly isolationists. But the Monroe Doctrine essentially said, we'll stay in the Western Hemisphere if Europe stays over in Europe, and we'll leave you alone if you leave us alone. And we try to go back to that. We don't want to get involved in another war, and so a lot of politicians see like, hey, we went away from the Monroe Doctrine. We got involved in Europe. 100,000 Americans died. It was absolutely awful, and we don't want to do that again. So you know what we should do? We should not get involved in Europe, and we should try and stop all the things that drug us into war with Europe, right? Trading with Europe. We went to war to defend Great Britain in large part because they were our biggest trading partner and they owed us a bunch of money. And if they lost this war, then they might not buy as much stuff from us, and we're not going to be able to get our money back. And so we need to trade less with them. And so we do the exact wrong thing at the exact wrong time. We decide to institute high tariffs to limit more trade. We try to cut ourselves off from Europe, which is going to exacerbate the Great Depression and make war more likely. I mean, I think the one thing, nobody knows exactly what it is that will eventually bring about world peace. But the one thing that we do know is the more that countries trade together, the less likely they are to go to war. And so limiting trade is not only going to hurt us economically, but it's also going to make war more likely. And so we will choose not to join the League of Nations as a part of this return to isolationism, which will essentially doom the League of Nations. And go back to isolationism. The average American, isn't thinking deeply enough about the topic of, European involvement. Woodrow Wilson saw it coming, right? Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points was like, we got to join the League of Nations, right? We have to work with the international community to limit imperialism. And, like America needs to be a leader in these areas. And the entire American public said, nope, no thanks. We want to go back to isolationism. right? Because it's politically safe. It's really hard to talk about this incredibly complex issue about why America should be more involved in the international community, not less involved. Right after the war to end all wars, right after World War One. Right? So the other argument that the isolationists make is that we don't need to be messing around in Europe because we've got bigger fish to fry here at home, right? With the rise of the Depression, we need to focus on our domestic problems and not worry about Europe. And again, we've kind of talked about like that. That really does appeal to a lot of people, but ultimately the problem of the Great Depression is a multitude of reasons, but in farming and industrial production, overproduction is the problem. We made too much stuff, people aren't buying it, prices are plummeting, businesses aren't making money, so they're firing people, stock prices plummet. Overproduction is a big part of the problem. And so this idea to say we're not going to be involved in the international community because we got to worry about the Depression at the home doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because if we're more involved in Europe and we're trading more with them, that gives us an opportunity to sell to larger markets, which limits the the overproduction. So that's it for today's lecture. I appreciate your time. I hope everybody is, at home, safe with their families, practicing social distancing and washing their hands. Have a good day, and I will see you again shortly.